We want to move over to Iran, where the UN's nuclear watchdog has troubling news about the state of their nuclear program. The news does not bode well for the Biden administration's efforts to return to the Iran nuclear deal that was struck back in 2015. But before we dig into that, it is worth remembering what Donald Trump told us about the deal when he was in office.
The fact is, this was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
A horrible deal that should have never been made. That is how Trump described the historic Iran nuclear agreement before he unilaterally tore it up back in 2018. And at the time, people actually warned him and the Iranian hawks who were egging him on, don't do this. It is a mistake. The 2015 deal, called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, took almost 2 years of intensive international negotiations to reach. Diplomats and physicists, the Iranians, 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Germany, and the EU were all part of this major international effort. And what did it achieve? Let's remind you of this. The 159-page document outlined a host of technical and political provisions that Iran, the United States, and other parties were bound by. But arguably, one of the most important parts was that Iran agreed to reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium by 98%. It also agreed to remove 2/3 of its centrifuges that enrich uranium, and it would keep its uranium stockpile under a certain limit, which could be used for non-nuclear purposes. And all of this really means that, according to the U.S., even if Iran violates the JCPOA commitments, Iran's breakout timeline for a single nuclear weapon would remain at least 1 year for the first decade of the JCPOA, and remain longer than the 2 to 3 months it is today for several years beyond year 10. Let that sink in, because the question is, how was that a horrible deal? Now, it's worth pointing out that the UN's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, monitored Iran after the deal, and it kept ensuring that the U.S., it kept ensuring to the U.S. that Iran was in fact complying with the agreement. And Trump's own State Department said in 2017 that they had, quote, full confidence in the agency, which was conducting on-site visits. Well, now, all those people who were warning Trump that pulling out of the deal was a bad idea, from Obama to Israeli officials to our allies across Europe, they're probably now saying, I told you so. Why? Because this week, according to a report by the IAEA that the NBC News, that NBC News and other outlets were able to see, Iran has significantly ramped up its uranium enrichment in recent months, accumulating enough that the possibility of Iran building a bomb can't be excluded. For perspective, they have now enriched 18 times the limits proposed by the 2015 deal. So what does this mean for that critical 1-year breakout period that the JCPOA created? Well, listen to what State Department spokesperson Ned Price said in April.
Since 2018, Iran has been in a position to accelerate its nuclear program in ways that would have been barred, would have been prevented by the JCPOA. Iran has been able to shrink that breakout time from where it started to a point where we can measure it in weeks rather than months.
And now, after this IAEA report, Daryl Kimball of the Arms Control Association think tank says the time it would take Iran to build a bomb can now be measured in days, not months or weeks. Iran has maintained that its nuclear program is peaceful and that it is not in its strategic interest to build a bomb. But if that changes tomorrow or next month, the world has very little time to respond before Iran becomes a nuclear-armed state if it chose to do so. And we have one person to thank for that, Donald Trump. Joining me now is MSNBC political analyst Peter Beinart. Peter is the author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack. He is also editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. Peter, it's great to see you again. Thank you for making time for us this afternoon. So Iran's not only accumulated a large stockpile of enriched uranium, it's increased how much it is producing rapidly in just the last 3 months. You know, we'll get into what this means in a moment, but this is what the 2015 nuclear deal was going to prevent from happening. Am I correct or am I wrong? They wanted to make sure that basically the international community had eyes and ears on Iran's breakout capability, which has now been reduced to days.
It was preventing Iran from doing that. According to the international inspectors, according to the Israeli intelligence, according to Trump's own intelligence, Iran was abiding by that deal, which, as you said, kept it at least a year away from building a nuclear weapon if it had decided to. American intelligence did not believe that Iran had decided to build a nuclear weapon, but if they decided to, they would be a year away. And although some of the restrictions eventually ran out, those restrictions lasted for years and in many cases decades. It was the most intrusive inspection program that any government had ever allowed vis-a-vis its nuclear program. Just to be, America doesn't allow that kind of inspections of our nuclear weapons programs. Israel doesn't allow that kind of inspection of its nuclear weapons facilities. So this was an extraordinarily good deal, and it was torpedoed by Donald Trump and his supporters. And now we have gotten exactly what they said they didn't want, which is an Iran with the capacity very quickly to build a nuclear bomb.
And all of this, unfortunately, is happening while this administration is trying to get back into a deal with Iran. I want to play for you some recent sound bites from both U.S. and Iranian officials on how these negotiations around the nuclear deal are coming along. Take a listen.
I would say simply that I'm not overly optimistic at the prospects of actually getting an agreement to conclusion, despite all the efforts we put into it.
We've been pretty close now for some time, and I think that tells you all you need to know about the difficulty of the issues that remain. So I would say the deal is not just around the corner, and it's not inevitable.
Peter, the Iranians feel like the U.S. hasn't shown the will to really reach a deal. And in a recent piece in the New York Times, you wrote, in the case of Iran, the U.S.'s unwillingness is both absurd and dangerous. Explain to us what's happening here from your perspective. I mean, Biden's been in office for over 2 years now. What's holding up the deal, you think?
What's holding up the deal right now is an issue that doesn't have to do with nuclear weapons at all. It has to do with the fact that Donald Trump added a new sanction on a part of the Iranian military called the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And he did that specifically as a poison pill to make the politics of withdrawing that sanction really difficult. Now, the sanction is basically irrelevant because the U.S. has so many other sanctions on that same part of the Iranian military. But Joe Biden doesn't want the political fight of being vulnerable to people saying, oh, you're going soft on the Iranian military, which has killed U.S. troops, which it has been. It's a very, very bad group. But this is symbolic because we have other sanctions on them already, sanctions that the Iranians are actually willing to swallow and go back into the deal. So for something which is basically meaningless and symbolic, the Biden administration is willing to allow the Iran nuclear deal to permanently collapse and allow Iran to be on the verge of being able to get a nuclear weapon, which means we could be on the war, or Israel could be on the verge of war.
What do you make of these new IAEA findings that Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, Peter, has grown more than 18 times what the 2015 deal actually allowed for? I mean, Iran's repeatedly said it does not have a goal to create a nuclear bomb, but if it did want to do so, the U.S. now has little time to react. Are the prospects of resurrecting the deal or creating a new one totally over? I mean, does this make securing a deal more important, or is there a point, even at this point, in trying to secure a deal?
It's going to take. Look, all we have is just a more hardline government in Iran than we previously had. This is one of the reasons that the Biden administration, I think, made a terrible mistake by not simply re-entering the deal on day one. Remember, it was us who withdrew from the deal. We violated our agreements. The Iranians, terrible regime as they are, they were keeping our agreements. We, who talk always about the rules-based international order that we are defending around the world, we went back on our word, and then we were not willing to go back into the the deal when Biden took over. He waited until a new hardline government took over. It's been harder now. And even now, he could re-enter the deal, but he doesn't want the political fight with Congress. And so probably I think the deal is dead, which creates a much more dangerous Middle East at exactly the moment that that's the last thing the United States can afford to deal with as it fights this war in Ukraine.
Yeah, you speak of a dangerous Middle East. The IAE chief, Rafael Grossi, is in Israel right now, speaking with the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett about this. Look, Bennett is a hawk on Iran. He has told him that there's a, quote, urgent need to confront Iran using all means to prevent it from making a nuclear bomb. Bennett has also said in recent months Israel can attack Iran if a deal is reached, and it has been carrying out airstrikes in the region specifically to target and threaten Iran. Do you feel that the Biden administration is taking all of this, seriously enough? I mean, the threat of Israel ramping up its actions towards Iran and leading to a full-blown conflict seem to be getting more real, if you will, by the day.
Absolutely. And in addition, Israel, according to reports, is going around and assassinating, people in Iran's military and has been doing so vis-a-vis scientists. And Iran may very well respond to these things, right? And so when you're carrying out these assassinations and counterattacks by Iran against shipping and other things, you never know when this may tip into something in which you start to get closer into an actual genuine war. And this is why I think what the Biden administration has done is so foolish, because they didn't want to have the political headache of a fight with Congress now. They've kicked the can down the road to a situation where they could very well be facing a real crisis, not just a political crisis, but a geopolitical crisis, later this fall or next year. How is that in their political interest?